Hello, folks. If you've watched my channel, which is still very young because I haven't put out a whole lot of videos, you know I'm reading Suetonius' The 12 Caesars, the Landmark Thucydides, few paragraphs of each at a time, roughly once every week or every other week or so, and I've done one Edgar Allan Poe short story, which I want to do some more in the future. Maybe some other things, uh, like talk about things that I write because I'm an indie author. But in my search in middle age to understand the classical world, which I tend to lean more towards the Romans, uh, because I started Latin class in high school decades ago, and I have a great mate who inspired me to get back into it and learn Latin, and then along the way also taking Greek. Um, I've always wanted, because I grew up poor, working class, I've always wanted to know, I don't mind the writings of the wealthy elites in the ancient world, the educated class, because they did write things for us that we can read and access. But I've always wondered, what about everybody else? What about the people who are like me? What about the people who are the majority of the world? Not just now, but going all the way back to the dawn of humanity, the working class, the farmers, the strugglers, the unhoused, uh, the laboring class, the vast bulk of the human condition. What about them? And usually, what we get told is, well, there's not a lot to know. They didn't write anything down, and sometimes it's said as if it's their fault, but most of them were not literate, or it's treated as if they weren't as interesting because they're common. So it's not the same thing. There's not going to be anything interesting. But for me, I've always felt that that's what drew me in. I want to know what they were like. I want to know how they were the same, how they were different. But the information was either scant or the teachers I had weren't really into that because they were classically trained and they just wanted to tell you about Cicero, or, Livy or Pliny or something like that. Which again, that's cool. But when you come from like my background, I'm gonna go with, people I think I can relate to. And that's those folks are just as much movers and shakers as a general who leads an army of 100,000 and goes off and conquers Gaul. To me, anyway. Some people may disagree. I don't think one's more important than the other. I think they both have their pros and cons. Um, but not paying attention to the vast majority of humanity seems weird to me. It just seems bizarre. So I've always wanted a book that told that. And I got one in the mail. It's by an author named Robert Knapp. It is called Invisible Romans. And prostitutes, outlaws, slaves, gladiators, ordinary men and women, the Romans that history forgot. The Scotsman calls it hugely ambitious, entertaining as well as informative. It's a pretty thick one. It's got a lot going on. I haven't, just like with Suetonius and Thucydides, I haven't read any of this. I only read the introduction. And I like how Robert Knapp says that his term for this is he wanted to write about the ordinary people of Rome, and that's what he calls them, because he struggled to find a term for it. So I did a short about this the day it came in the mail while I was laid up with asthma. And I thought, oh, I can't read, great to read this. And then I thought, wait a minute, my whole channel is about reading ancient things to overcome social anxiety, which I have trouble getting talking to a camera because to me it's like talking to a person. So that's one my personal combat against my own uh, weaknesses, but also to get people like me interested in classics, interested in the ancient world. And of course, I'm starting with Rome and Greece. I'd love to spread out to some other things too, because I'm native here in America. Um, and my ancestry is African and Native American and Irish, or so the story goes, somewhere in the UK. So I'd love to get into Africa and Native American readings as well. But I'm starting off with Rome and Greece because I'm taking Latin class and Greek class. And of course, My instructors are always lovingly suggesting things to read. This came up in the book club with Helen McVeigh's Classics Academy. Now, I didn't get into the day they had this book. I missed that. My book just came. But I thought, this is what my channel's all about. Why don't I just read it with y'all? So, we're going to do just that. I'm going to try to break down chapter one, which I only glanced at. It's like 54 pages, so his chapters are pretty beefy. So, I'm going to break this down. I'm going to read maybe a couple pages of each, and we'll move it along until we get all the way through the book. And then by the end of it, you and I will have a better understanding of what the average person in Rome was like. We'll have a better understanding of the overall picture of ancient Rome, and hopefully see some points of relation between ourselves and them, and where things completely diverge. Chapter 1, In the Middle, Ordinary Men. The elite of the Roman Empire, emperors, senators, equestrians, and the local elite of magistrates, town councilors, and priests, produce almost all the literature and extraordinary material culture which is commonly spoken of as quote unquote Roman. As a result, treatment of Roman normally means applying the mind, world, and culture of the elite to a description of the entire Roman population, as when people write and speak of quote unquote Roman civilization or quote unquote Roman attitudes towards women. Here, I move away from that habit of and focus rather on the ordinary men, people below and generally invisible to those high in the social pyramid. By quote unquote ordinary men, I mean every free person below the elite and above the poor day laborer or peasant. Their outlook, seen through their own eyes, reveals a rich mosaic of attitudes and actions as they live their lives outside the blinkered view of the empire's aristocracies. Although their mind world is the same as the elites in some basic ways, they are both part of the same overarching culture after all. Outlooks and attitudes in general differ significantly. The imperial elite stood at the top of the Roman socio-economic pyramid. To qualify, a person had to be worth over 400,000 sesterces, equestrian, or over 1 million sesterces, senatorial. Among the approximately 50 to 60 million people in the Roman Empire, there were perhaps 5,000 adult men possessing such extreme wealth. Beneath, but mostly far beneath, these were the elite of the local towns of the empire. An average of 100 or 125 adult males in each of the 250 or 300 towns of the empire that rose above the level of village would produce another 30,000 to 35,000 very wealthy persons. Because of the steep socio-economic gradation of the Roman world, these elite together probably held 80% or more of the total wealth. The Romans themselves recognized this break in socio-economic situation between elite and non-elite by calling the super wealthy honestiores, or more honorable ones, and all the rest of the free persons humiliores, lesser beings. This, quote unquote, all the rest was 99.5% of the population. Below these super wealthy were a fair number of persons who had many fewer resources in comparison to the very rich, but resources sufficient at the lower end to be fairly certain of their daily bread, and on the upper end to enjoy a lifestyle that allowed enough leisure to pursue some social, political, and cultural interest. These were the more modest landowners, the merchants and artisans, successful soldiers, and those financed by these groups and by the elites, professional teachers, doctors, architects, and so on. These men and their families numbered resources, these men and their families numbered perhaps 25% of the total population, excuse me. Besides a certain stability and resources, another commonality unites these ordinary people. They all value labor, whether they are merchants or artisans or wealthy peasants. They share that important socio-economic fact, which binds together their outlooks even though the actual wealth level and occupation of individuals varies greatly. It is these people I am concerned with here. The challenge is to capture their mind world. So, important thing whenever I watch lectures of any classes talking about anything in the ancient world, they always bring up, and I think wisely so, that we should try to see things as the ancients saw it. Because again, and I'll reiterate this over and over again, you're always going to see things where you can relate to human beings because human beings change very slowly. But you're also going to see a lot of things where their outlook is way different from ours. And they did not see quite a few things anywhere near like we do. So trying to put a completely modern spin on things isn't always going to work. Uh, but I also don't think giving a modern opinion on things is wrong either. Because when I read the historians I read in ancient time, they gave their opinion on things that happened before them. They had no problem with that. That is a human thing to do, and we don't do any different. So, subheading social attitudes. Marks of hierarchy and place were everywhere. For example, the 10,000 denarii donation of Manius Megonius Leo, a citizen of the Italian town of Petelia, modern Strongoli, for a foundation was to be invested and the income distributed hierarchically. 450 plus denarii income per year was spent on the anniversary of his birth. 300 denarii funded a banquet, but only for the local elite, the Decurions. After cost of the banquet, anything left of the 300 was distributed in cash to the Decurions present. In addition, 150 denarii were designated for a banquet for the Augustales, the elite priestly group of wealthy freedmen, with the remainder after cost divided among the Augustales present. Finally, each male citizen and his wife were given a single denarius, equivalent to a working man's good daily wage. No banquet was provided. This sort of graded gifting made the social hierarchy very visible, much as the graded seating of the amphitheaters did. Living in an unremittingly stratified world, the middling sort absorbed one of the basic attitudes of such a life: deal with equals as equals, take advantage of those below you when possible, defer to those above you always. An individual's mental state focuses his abilities on avoiding infliction of injury on himself, either physical or mental, and on inflicting injury on others. In Roman terms, defending his honor and standing by lessening the honor and standing of others, while at the same time protecting his own from diminution at the hands of those thought inferior. Subordination to a lesser being or assimilation to a group below his station, e.g., slaves, in the mind or action of a superior was a horrible thing. The mind world was simpler with regard to those obviously superior, elite, and obviously inferior, slaves, than with the common man's peers. In the latter group, there were huge differences of status and power, but no clear markers of quote unquote legitimate subordination or superiority. It was in this world that slights to honor, hostilities, and rivalries worked themselves out in the liveliest manner. And we can but imagine what those liveliest manners were. Everything from probably really good cracks to outright violence. Hierarchical thinking places specific expectations and stereotypes in the minds of each group. The ordinary men were no exception. Scholars identify five of the most common prejudices: against freedmen, against the poor, against slaves, against merchants, and against work. It is worth examining each through the eyes of ordinary people. Free birth was the default preferred condition. It had no legal liabilities and had none of the constraints imposed by slavery and manumitted status. The vast majority of the free population at any given time would be freeborn, as the legal status of the manumitted disappeared with the manumitted generation. It is clear that the elite held strong prejudices against freedmen who pretended to assert their social or economic capital. While it is generally assumed that the elite prejudice against freedmen would have been held in all segments of freeborn society, there is little evidence for this. A full discussion appears in the chapter on freedmen. Certainly, however, the prejudice against the poor was real. The graffito on a wall in Pompeii says it all. And it says, I hate poor people. If anyone wants something for nothing, he is a fool. He should pay for it. We hear that to this day when you see people talk about they don't like welfare, they don't like social services and healthcare for all, etc. Likewise, the Epistle of James in the New Testament indicates clearly this prejudice, although the author's purpose is to argue against it within the context of the Christian community. My brothers, as believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, don't show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, "Here's a good seat for you," but say to the poor man, "You stand there," or "Sit on the floor by my feet," have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? That is James chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, for anybody who wants to go read that for themselves. A great prejudice also existed between the ordinary man and the enslaved population. Here we can turn to Paul. In his addresses to groups of Christians, he constantly emphasizes by negation the fundamental distinction between free and slave in society. His repetitiousness is evidence that old prejudices die hard. His addresses clearly struggled with his advice to treat their slaves with less prejudice and often failed. Another illustration of the chasm between free and slave comes from the golden ass. Lucius's transformation into an ass and back again can easily be read as an allegorical journey from freedom to slavery to freedom. All of his adventures show that the condition of being a slave is bad, that slaves are subhuman. Another prejudice must be disposed of: ill feeling against merchants. The general view of the elite was that merchants were lying thieves. Did ordinary people share this view? Paul's letter to the Philippians uses language that is extensively mercantile. Verbs of accounting and exchange are common, and they are used to convey Paul's ideas about the Christian community. Not only does this indicate Paul's own background as a man of commerce, but also that the audience was operating in this exchange and business environment and felt positive about it. Lydia, the purple merchant, was active in the same milieu. Again, there is no negative connotation. Businessmen themselves took great pride in their accomplishments, as did this long distance merchant when he said, "If it is no trouble, passerby, hold up and read this epitaph. I often coursed over the great sea with swift sailed craft and reached many lands. This is the end which once upon a time the fates spun for me at my birth. Here I have laid down all my cares and labors. Here I do not fear the stars, nor the clouds, nor the savage sea, nor do I fear that expenses will outrun my profits." And besides the long distance traders, there were local, short range businessmen who dealt either in locally produced goods or on a small scale, or brought wholesale and resold at the local level. Epigraphy attests to these merchants seeing themselves as the mirror image of the cheating, dishonest dealers of elite lore. Lucius Nerusius Mithras, a merchant from a small town, noted, "I sold goods which the people could use. My honesty was always praised everywhere. Life was good. I always paid my taxes. I was straightforward in everything, as fair as I was able to everyone I dealt with. I helped as much as I could those seeking my aid. Among my friends, I was highly thought of." Praecilius in Argentarius Incerta, and so a member of the highly suspect banker class of merchant, notes that he always had the trust of his customers and was always truthful and good when he wrote, "Here I am silent, describing my life in verse. I enjoyed a bright reputation in the height of prosperity. Praecilius by name, a native of Cirta, I was a skillful banker. My honesty was wonderful, and I always adhered to truth. I was courteous to all men, and whose distress did I not succor? I was always gay and hospitable to my dear friends. A great change came over my life after the death of the virtuous Valeria. As long as I could, I enjoyed the sweets of holy matrimony. I celebrated 100 happy birthdays in virtue and happiness. But the last day has arrived as the spirit leaves my exhausted limbs. Alive, I earned the titles which you read, as fortune willed it. She never deserted me. Follow me in like manner. Here I await you. Come." And in that, you can see certain things that you can relate. Like, I've never been a banker. I've never been well off financially. I've never been in the upper middle class. But you can see that the writings of a man at the end of his life, looking back on his own days, his own mortality, those things you can relate to and understand. And clearly, so far, right here in Ordinary Men, uh, Robert Knapp is talking about the, I guess, middle class wasn't what they would have called. That's also a modern term, but more or less the middle class of Roman society. Naturally, merchants saw no problem in seeking gain and thanked the gods for it. In this example, dedicated 3 days before the 1st of June in the consulship of Dexter for the second time, and Fuscus, sacred to Mercury, mighty prophet giver and prophet preserver, Gaius Gemellus Valerianus, son of Gaius, of the Ufantina district, member of the four-man board with police authority, judicial prefect, with Colonia Secunda his wife, and Valeria and Valeriana Secunda his children. He set this up in fulfillment of a vow and dedicated it in a spot authorized by the municipal authorities. Thus, merchants had a good opinion of themselves. Of course, it is easy to suppose that relations in specific instances could become strained, but the evidence from Artemidorus and elsewhere is consonant with the positive impression Paul's experiences give of ordinary men associating normally with such fellows. Likewise, businessmen in Apuleius' golden ass and in Petronius' Satyricon are treated as normal people. They are not stigmatized, and those are two things, like so many works, I will want to get to in the future. In a similar vein, there is no indication among ordinary folk of the disdain for craftsmen felt by elites such as Cicero, who states that quote unquote all craftsmen are engaged in base trades. Rather, the father of the literary Lucian is exemplary of how middling men looked at trades. Lucian's father wanted his son educated to a certain degree, but his long range goal was to apprentice him to one of his wife's brothers so he could learn a trade. Lucian rebelled against this, but that fact does not take away from the reality that his father believed a career as an artisan would be good for everyone. There was no shame felt by Lucian's family that the artisan life, and in fact even Lucian, was tempted until, in a further dream, education, capital E, as a, I guess, a spirit or a god or what have you, convinced him that the elite view of the trades, that they are vulgar, was correct, and persuaded him to pursue a career through learning and rhetoric. It's just the funniest thing. Like this guy's like, yeah, become an artisan, says your parents. Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Which like nowadays, even then, people would, parents nowadays would look at you like, oh, well, you want a job where you make, regular money. You don't want to be an artist. Even then, it was like, oh no, no, be an artist. But then you go to sleep, and in your dreams, education, the giant of education comes and just smacks you around. It's like, nah, no, no, you gotta get in rhetoric. A further note of pride tempered with sadness comes from the epitaph of Virius Vitalis Maximus. He had adopted Virius Vitalis, quote unquote, a lad of incomparable promise in the craftsman's calling, had raised him up in the profession, and hoped that the boy would carry on his trade, supporting him in his old age. In both Artemidorus' interpretation of dreams and the Carmen Astrologicum, various artisanal activities are mentioned as well as business situations. There is no hint that people so engaged were looked down upon. So, if they are looked down upon, what I'm getting from this, it's from the elites and the typical people we're told about who write in the ancient Roman world, who you're usually told to go read. And again, I'm not telling you not to read them. I would encourage you to read them. Uh, should always try to get other people's viewpoints on things, especially historically. But yes, so that puts us at page 11, and I can start the next main bulk paragraph for the next time. So that is the start of the first chapter of Invisible Romans. I'm hooked already. We've already discussed merchants. We're on artisans as well. We're looking at this sort of 25% of the Roman population, not rich, not poor. It's cut in the middle. That sort of tells me there's always been a sort of middle class historically, at least in the city, once you get to the city empire state, um, even if it wasn't called that. And I like Robert Knapp's writing style. He's very direct and to the point. So I'm looking forward to getting into more of this with y'all. If you like this or if you've read this book, let me know what you think about it overall. But try not to listen to any spoilers if you've read it all the way through. But that's it for now because I see this video is pretty lengthy. So thank you very much if you tuned into this. Feel free to comment. The whole like, subscribe thing. And I hope y'all stay safe out there, stay learning, and stay growing. And I'll see you next time.